Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are now heard across the globe. Welcome to the Middle East Forum of Falmouth Lectures. I'm Alan Taylor, the president of the Middle East Forum of Falmouth, abbreviated as MEFF, M-E-F-F. For those of you new to the forum, we are a 501c3 nonprofit or volunteer-run organization founded in 2006. Over the course of each season, we present a series of talks that represent a broad range of perspectives and opinions addressing the complex issues facing the Middle East. Needless to say, the Middle East is in dynamic flux and demands our attention. We have learned so much from our first three lectures. One by Trita Parsi described the fluid situation in and with Iran. James Lindsay explained missions, accomplishments, and failures of the United Nations Relief Works Agency and Israel's frustration and disassembly of it. 2 weeks ago, Stephen Cook shared with laser precision and his perspectives regarding U.S. policy as it relates to and influences engagement between Arabs, Iranians, Israelis, and Turks. Currently, the priorities and the American ambitions are difficult to parse. Today, our perspective and understanding of this complex situation will be deepened considerably by Dr. Bdour, despite it being midnight in Amman. And thank you so much, Farah, for staying awake for us. As she wrote in her recent United States Institute for Peace journal, Jordan sits at the heart of the ever-shifting sands in the Middle East, walking a tightrope between maintaining neighborly relations, advancing national interests, and containing threats to ensure its own security and stability. So we can expect another dynamic lecture. Please use the question and answer anytime during the talk. And at this point, I'll turn the floor over to Andrew Davis, our moderator for today, who will introduce Dr. Bdour.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everybody. Nearly 3 days after the signing of the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty, the strategic relationship between these two countries is under growing pressure. Amid the ongoing crisis in Gaza, rising tensions in the West Bank, the shutting of U.S. aid, instability surrounding UNRWA, the UN, and Syria, and the unpredictable dynamics of the Trump administration, Jordan's ability to sustain its relationship agreement with Israel is being tested on multiple fronts. This session will examine whether the foundation of the peace agreement has fundamentally shifted in the wake of the October 7th events, or whether shared threat perceptions by Jordan and Israel remain sufficient to uphold the treaty's core security and political commitments. Farah's presentation will also explore what confidence-building measures, if any, could preserve bilateral cooperation in a rapidly transforming Middle East. Today's presenter, Farah Bdour, is a political analyst and specialist in conflict resolution and mediation with a focus on Jordan-Israel relations. She has over a decade of experience in peace-building at both the policy and civil society levels. Farah is a senior advisor at the Palestinian Territories, Egypt, and the Levant program at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. Previously, she served as director of a Jordanian think tank that provides policy analysis and recommendations to the strategic community in Jordan and internationally. She's also served as the Jordan Country Director for Seeds of Peace and is on the advisory board of the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, where she contributes to initiatives focused on dialogue, reconciliation, and people-to-people peace building. Today, as Alan mentioned, she's coming to us via Zoom from Amman, Jordan. And with that, I am very honored to turn the microphone over to Farah Bdour. Over to you, Farah.
You are muted. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Let me begin by thanking the Middle East Forum of Falmouth, and especially Alan, Andrew, and Carlos from behind the scenes for organizing this webinar and creating a space to engage with such a critical issue, the strategic relationship between Jordan and Israel, and for creating a space to shed the light on a small country that is, in my view, often misunderstood. The urgency of this conversation cannot be overstated. As Andrew mentioned, with the ongoing war in Gaza, the rising tensions in the West Bank, and an increasingly volatile regional security landscape, the Jordan-Israel relationship is under unprecedented strain. These developments demand not only a close attention, but also a deeper understanding of the underlying DNA of this relationship. To illustrate its complexity, I often compare Jordan-Israel relationship to the perplexing phenomenon of a quantum entanglement, a condition in which two particles become so deeply intertwined that no matter how far apart they are in space, their state of one instantly affect the other. And similarly, the actions taken by one state, Israel or Jordan, will inevitably reverberate through the other. But before we dive into the bilateral relationship, let me begin with a fundamental point. Jordan is often analyzed both in academia and policy discourse primarily through a Palestinian lens. And that's understandable given three key factors: our geography, our demography, and the enduring centrality of the Palestinian issue in regional politics. Geographically, Jordan and Israel, including the future Palestinian state, share more than 400 kilometers of border, and this is the longest border that Israel shares with any neighboring country. Demographically, over 2 million Palestinian refugees reside in Jordan, and this is the largest Palestinian population outside of the occupied territories. Politically, we live in the shadow of the longest unresolved occupation in modern history, one that persisted for over 75 years. But while the Palestinian lens is important, it can also be limiting. It risks reducing Jordan's agency to a function of the conflict, as though Jordan exists only in reaction to the Palestinian issue, rather than recognizing the full scope of Jordan's strategic choices, domestic dynamics, and national identity. And too often, this framing traps Jordan in a narrative that views its creation as artificial, that its primary purpose reduced to that of a buffer state meant to protect Israel, or in the eyes of some Arab and Islamic groups as illegitimate and existing solely as a platform for the Palestinian liberation project. But to truly understand Jordan's choices, priorities, and most importantly, its anxieties, we must revisit a foundational moment in our national history, and that is the Qais Treaty of 1920. It was during this event that Jordanian tribal leaders articulated the first political program aimed at consolidating their authority and shaping the future of the territory they claimed. The program rested on 16 articles, including a call for the creation of an independent state with Jordan River as its western border. It also envisioned the state being led by an Arab emir, though his identity was unspecified at that time. The program also included the formation of a national army backed by the British and the prevention of a Jewish immigration and land sales to the Jewish people. This foundational moment explains why the idea of Jordan as an alternative homeland for Palestinians is seen in Amman not merely as a demographic threat, but as a violation of a century-old political identity. From the outset, Jordanians envisioned a unique national identity in a state of their own and not a fallback territory for the unresolved conflicts in the region. And this is also why a key strategic motivation behind Jordan's decision to sign the 1994 peace treaty with Israel was to decisively put to rest the notion of Jordan as a substitute for Palestine. So when the moment in history came at the Madrid conference in the early 1990s, and there was an Arab consensus to end the state of war with Israel, Jordan seized the opportunity to prioritize its national interest. This decision followed the realization that the Palestinian leadership were negotiating directly with Israel and bypassing Jordan entirely. From a Jordanian perspective, by formalizing its western border and gaining Israeli recognition of its sovereignty and effectively ending the alternative homeland narrative, the treaty served as a geopolitical firewall. It was a statement that Jordan is a sovereign state, not a substitute. So this is to say that the peace treaty was not only about peace, it was about preservation of Jordan's identity, sovereignty, and demographic integrity in the face of regional narratives that sought to erase them. And any return to annexationist or transfer-oriented rhetoric from Israeli leaders or attempts by groups like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood to use Jordan as a base for quote-unquote resistance are viewed in Amman not merely as a political provocations, but as an existential threats. Now, after signing the peace treaty with Israel, we witnessed a brief period of what academia has labeled the euphoria of peace. People in Jordan envisioned having breakfast in Amman, lunch in Jerusalem, and dinner in Beirut, while enjoying the economic dividends of peace. And there is no question that the chemistry and commitment between the two visionary leaders, King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin, played a significant role in building and sealing this agreement. But the euphoria didn't last long, as we all know. It ended with the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, followed by the election of Mr. Netanyahu, the eruption of the Second Intifada, the continued settlement expansion, and ultimately the collapse of the entire Land for Peace model under Oslo. Since the treaty's signing in 1994, 7 right-wing governments have shaped Israel's bilateral relations with Jordan, 5 of them under Netanyahu's leadership. And under these governments, tensions over Israeli policies on Jerusalem and annexations simmered for years and regularly erupted into crisis. One example was President Trump's deal of the century in 2020, which prompted King Abdullah II to warn of a massive conflict if Israel proceeded with the plans to annex the West Bank territory and threatening the viability of a future Palestinian state. Another moment of a crisis came in 2021 when the Jewish extremists stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque, Al-Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, violating the status quo and the prior understanding Netanyahu himself had reached with King Abdullah and Secretary Kerry in 2014. Despite these tensions, Israel's military and intelligence establishment historically played a buffering role in insulating the bilateral relations from political deterioration. Their appreciation of Jordan's strategic value to Israel's own security led them to influence policies on Jerusalem and unilateral actions in the West Bank. The calculus from their perspective was simple. Instability in the Palestinian territories could spark a domino effect that would destabilize Jordan and ultimately harming Israel's own security on the longest border it shares with a neighboring country. For over 30 years, Israel's border with Jordan is the most secure and the most stable. Jordan, for its part, adopted a dual-track approach when dealing with Israel. As political relations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and King Abdullah deteriorated, Amman adopted a more nuanced strategy. Jordanian diplomacy drew a clear distinction between Israel's political and security establishment. Engagement with a political leadership was downgraded to middle-level diplomatic contacts, while security cooperation continued, focused on issues beyond the Palestinian file, including border security, counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, search and rescue, and many, many more. This distinction allowed Jordan to preserve vital security cooperation with Israel while voicing opposition to policies that threatened its national security. And this nuanced approach helped preserve a degree of stability in the bilateral relationship. But with the arrival of Israel's most extreme government to date in 2023, the equation has fundamentally changed. Given the annexationist agenda of the newly appointed minister, Jordan viewed the trajectory of the relationship as veering into a dangerous new territory. At the same time, Amman watched with deep concern as Israel's security institutions, who have long been attuned to Jordan's stability needs, were systematically weakened by ideological figures in Mr. Netanyahu's government. Major structural changes in the defense ministry and national security apparatus further eroded their ability to shield the bilateral relationship from political turbulence. A growing fear took hold in Amman that the most critical relationship Jordan has with a neighboring state was now being held hostage by extremist ministers, while traditional security interlocutors were being sidelined. An alarming assessment began to take shape that this is a government that intends on resolving the Palestinian issue at Jordan's expense. And as a result, Jordanian officials began voicing serious concerns that the Israeli policies in the West Bank might lead to a violent uprising and potentially the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. Such a scenario, they feared, could empower radical actors who feed off the frustration of the Palestinian people, whose right for self-determination has been reduced to little more than the prospects of work permits. Then came the terrorist attack of October 7 in 2023, and with it, an even sharper strain in the bilateral relationship. The devastating images from Gaza, particularly the large number of civilians and child casualties, sparked nationwide protest in Jordan, with demonstrators calling for the annulment of the peace treaty with Israel. And meanwhile, and as the world focused on the war in Gaza, Israel's far-right government seized this opportunity to advance its agendas in the West Bank. Waves of settlers' violence were unleashed as extremist groups torched Palestinian villages and killed civilians. Even Israel's own Shin Bet classified some of these attacks as acts of terrorism. For Jordan, the threat reached alarming levels yet again. The war in Gaza, the escalating chaos in the West Bank, and dangerous actions by Israel's far-right coalition forced officials in Amman to reassess the long-held security assumptions about their neighbor. Reports that Israel considered transferring Gazans to Egypt's Sinai only intensify these anxieties. Amman warned of the Gazification of the West Bank, the fear that Israeli policies of siege, displacement, and fragmentation could be replicated in their own backyard. During that time, debate intensified in Amman over the value of maintaining the peace treaty, even among its long-standing defenders. After all, the treaty was meant to prevent the alternative homeland scenario. And as Israel's actions increasingly undermined the two-state solution, Jordanians began to question the treaty's value. And this skepticism has forced the government to be explicit and vocal about these threats. Jordan was quick to denounce any forced transfer of Palestinians as a violation of international law. The Jordanian Prime Minister publicly declared that any forced transfer of Palestinians or policies that create conditions leading to such a transfer would be considered a declaration of war and a material breach of the 1994 peace treaty. Numerous Jordanian officials made it in one way or another clear that the kingdom would not passively absorb the consequences of Netanyahu's government's choices. At the same time, Israeli security officials echoed the Jordanian premier's concerns. Reports indicated that the Shin Bet expressed serious warnings to Netanyahu's government about the potential for widespread violence in the West Bank if far-right settler violence continued unchecked. Jordan doubled down on its messaging to Israel with decisive political and military signals. It deployed reinforcement to the border and issued explicit warning from the Prime Minister that Jordan would use all means at its disposal to resist any forced transfer scenarios. Meanwhile, Jordan took proactive steps to stabilize the West Bank. It sent a field hospital to Nablus and convened an international conference to support the Palestinian Authority. On a diplomatic front, Jordan recalled its ambassador from Tel Aviv and made the return of Israel's ambassador to Amman conditional on the cessation of hostilities in Gaza. The kingdom also coordinated closely with Egypt and regional and international partners to end the war, reject any proposal that isolate Gaza from the West Bank, and oppose attempts to address the conflict solely through a military lens. Amman has consistently insisted that Israel must shift from a conflict management approach to a sustainable conflict resolution framework, one that includes irreversible steps toward a two-state solution. Jordan has also made it clear that any post-war Arab role in Gaza must be conditioned on the establishment of a credible political horizon. Now, to make matters worse, and while Jordan was grappling with destabilizing policies from Netanyahu's government along its western border, Hamas and Iran assessed that the opportunity was ripe to penetrate Jordan. Both viewed Jordanian's geography as essential to consolidating their strategic objectives. From Iran's perspective, Jordan has long been seen as a crucial piece in its ring of fire strategy to encircle Israel. Even before October 7, Iran sought to destabilize Jordan by flooding the country with narcotics through its Syrian proxies. These efforts intensified following October 7th and were coupled with mobilization of Iran-backed Iraqi militias to pressure Jordan's eastern borders. In addition, Iran's support for terrorist cells operating within Jordan became a mounting concern. Jordanian security forces uncovered such cells in Jordan where significant quantities of explosive materials were found and apparently intended for attacks on local targets. These threats were compounded by attacks on American installations inside Jordan, such as the assault on Tower 22 at the Tanaf military base, which resulted in the death of 3 American soldiers. Altogether, these developments placed extraordinary strain on Jordan's security apparatus and led to multiple confrontations that claimed the lives of Jordanian soldiers. From Hamas' perspective, and as supporting Gaza declined and efforts to establish a foothold in the West Bank flattered, Jordan appeared increasingly attractive. In desperation, Hamas sought to influence Jordanian public opinion in order to offset its losses elsewhere and secure a strategic foothold. The devastating images from Gaza, combined with the inflammatory rhetoric from Israeli ministers targeting Jordan, initially aided Hamas's narrative. Hamas leaders quickly tuned into the Jordanian mood. In public statements, they directly addressed the Jordanian people with explicit messages addressing the tribes, claiming that the Palestinian resistance was defending Jordan from Smotrich's schemes to make Jordan an alternative homeland for Palestinians. And these messages hit a chord among the Jordanian tribes. These messages also coincide with an aggressive defamation campaign against Jordan by Hamas and its supporters. Rumors circulated that the Royal Jordanian Air Force bases were being used by American aircrafts to supply the Israeli military during the Gaza campaign. Other conspiracies alleged that the Jordanian field hospitals in Gaza served as a front for Israeli intelligence operations. Social media further fueled these claims by questioning why Israel would approve Jordan's airdrop missions in Gaza unless there was a covert cooperation. Additional accusations targeted Jordan companies, suggesting that they were exporting food and vegetables to Israel through a land corridor, an act portrayed online as quote-unquote partnership in genocide. Hamas sought to exploit public anger and mobilize sympathy inside the kingdom, even floating the idea of relocating its leadership to Jordan after it was expelled from the country in 1999. Even more concerning, Jordanian security services later uncovered a terrorist cell in Amman linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, planning to manufacture drones and rockets targeting local sites, not to mention the campaign against the Jordanian embassies abroad. As Jordan confronted mounting threats domestically and on its western front, in April 2024, it suddenly found itself caught between 2 powerful neighbors with opposing but equally destabilizing agendas: an extreme Messianic Israeli government on one side and an ideologically driven hegemonic regime in Iran on the other. On April 12th, Iran launched its first direct missile attacks on Israel, sending hundreds of projectiles across Jordanian skies. And Jordan found itself caught in the direct line of fire. Air raid sirens became a part of Jordanians' daily lives, and some missiles struck populated area, heating public anxiety and deepening fears of being dragged into a war they had no role in starting. Another attack on Israel took place on October 2nd, the same year, and again, Jordan found itself caught in the same line of fire. In both instances, Jordan played a critical role in intercepting the Iranian missiles. This response was coordinated through CENTCOM and in partnership with the United States and regional allies. Jordan did not frame its responses as an act of defending Netanyahu's government, whose conduct in Gaza has sparked widespread outrage in Jordan and across the Arab world, of course. Instead, it was presented as an act of national self-defense, a measure to protect Jordanian sovereignty, its people, and its airspace. Yet in reality, Jordan's action also contributed to protecting the Israeli civilians. By participating in the regional interception effort, Jordan helped prevent a greater loss of life on both sides of the border. It acted as a responsible regional actor, one that, even under immense pressure, remained committed to de-escalation and the preservation of life. And in doing so, Jordan stayed true to the principles of the 1994 peace treaty, principles it continues to honor, even as they are increasingly ignored by Netanyahu's current government. The April 12th and October 2nd attack offer an important lesson about these principles in practice. The peace treaty envisioned a broader regional security architecture, akin to the Helsinki model in Europe, where states commit not only to non-aggression, but to cooperative security measures, mutual respect for sovereignty, and an ongoing dialogue to resolve disputes. In both episodes, we saw a glimpse of how such a model could function in the Middle East. Regional actors coordinating to intercept threats, protect civilian lives, and address shared fears and concerns through collective action. These moments underscore that lasting security and stability are best achieved not through unilateral force, but through inclusive frameworks that give all parties a stake in the region's safety. Yet today, the Middle East security landscape is being shaped in the opposite direction, unilaterally and increasingly by Israel. During the June 2025 Israel attack on Iran nuclear facilities, Jordan once again found itself in the line of fire for the third time in just over a year. The episode generated profound unease, not only because Jordan was directly exposed, but also because instability in the Gulf had suddenly become a real possibility. For decades, the Gulf states have served as Jordan's strategic Arab depth, providing vital economic assistance and acting as a political and financial safety net. The June strikes triggered acute anxiety in Amman. Fears of potential nuclear contamination in the Gulf states were coupled with concerns that escalation could intensify humanitarian suffering and weaken the Gulf economies that underpin Jordan's stability. Nearly 400,000 Jordanians work in the Gulf, and any serious downturn or instability there could trigger a large-scale return to the kingdom, adding severe economic strain to the country already hosting over 1.4 million Syrian refugees and a substantial Palestinian refugee population. This would stretch Jordan's limited resources even further and test its ability to maintain domestic stability. On the other hand, there was a concern in Amman that the region could be pushed toward destabilizing arms race. As one of the most consequential outcomes of the June conflict was the consolidation of Israel's self-reliance security model. Arab states increasingly view this model as a blueprint for their own defense. They are now investing more in indigenous capabilities and taking a greater ownership of their national security. For Jordan, this shift in the regional security environment brings complex and far-reaching implications. This trajectory stand, as I said, in a sharp contrast to the April and October 2nd, 2024 missiles attack, when Jordan, Israel, regional partners worked together under US-led coordination to intercept incoming threats. In those instances, collective action helped prevent a greater loss of life and demonstrated the stabilizing potential of cooperative security frameworks. And by comparison, that June conflict reflected a turn toward a unilateral military action, one that may erode the spirit of multilateral coordination and replace it with competitive rearmament and raising the risk of miscalculations and escalation across the region. Such unilateralism is not limited to June conflict. Israel is now pursuing policies that put long-term regional stability at risk. And nowhere is this clearer than in the way it's managing the 7 active fronts, and particularly in Gaza, the West Bank, and Syria, 2 of which are on Jordan's doorsteps, relying almost exclusively on military power and sidelining diplomacy and acting in an open disregard of the advice from its own top-brass security establishment. This is where the Syrian file becomes especially relevant. Beyond its role in Israel's broader military calculus, Syria sits at the heart of Jordan's own security priorities and making developments there a decisive, if often understated, factor in the trajectory of Jordan's-Israel relations. For Amman, stabilizing Syria became a core national security imperative. The kingdom's 280 kilometers shared border with Syria has over the past decade been a target of a persistent infiltration attempts by narcotics networks, ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates, threats that directly undermine Jordan's internal stability. Economically, Syria has historically functioned as Jordan's primarily overland trade route to Europe via Turkey. The prolonged closure of this route has imposed heavy costs on the Jordanian economy and limiting export competitiveness and increasing dependence on more expensive alternatives. And demographically, as I mentioned earlier, Jordan is the home for over 1 million Syrian refugees, which adds urgency to the need to secure and functional Syrian state capable of facilitating a voluntarily and dignified repatriation. In this context, developments in Syria are seen in Amman as central to Jordan's strategic calculus and shaping both its regional diplomacy and its complex security-driven relationship with Israel. Since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime and the rise of the interim government in Damascus under Ahmad al-Shara, Jordan has moved swiftly to prioritize Syria stabilization as core elements of its national security strategy. In December 2024, Amman convened the Al-Aqaba Summit, bringing together Arab, regional, and international players to endorse a Syrian-led political transition in line with the UN Security Council resolutions and emphasizing Syria's sovereignty and territorial unity. The summit's central objective was to outline a roadmap for Syria's reintegration into the Arab fold, one that would decisively pull Damascus out of the Iranians' orbit. Building on this diplomatic momentum, a series of high-level meetings between Jordanian and Syrian officials accelerated bilateral cooperation to address the shared threats on cross-border smuggling, militia infiltration, and regional instability. Amman approach reflects a deliberate patience toward the new Syrian government, rooted in a sober assessment of the magnitude of the challenges it faces. Ahmad al-Shara facing governing a country that is shattered by more than a decade of civil war, dismantling the entrenched network and loyalists of the Assad era, and countering Iran's ongoing efforts to re-establish the oxygen corridor to Hezbollah, and addressing the grievances of Syrian diverse social fabric, including the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians, and others. And from Jordan's perspective, these challenges demand sustained regional and international support. Israel's approach to Syria diverged sharply from Jordan's. While Amman views a stable Syria as a critical buffer against Iranian expansion and non-state armed groups, Israel has pursued unilateral military measures in southwestern Syria, anchored in a plan to establish a demilitarized buffer zone along the Golan Heights, invoking the protection of the Druze as a justification. Israel has enriched its presence in parts of the Ondof zone and shown little willingness to work through regional or multilateral channels. For Jordan, this creates two strategic risks. First, uncoordinated Israeli operations threaten to destabilize its northern border and undermining the careful diplomatic and security channels Amman has built with the new Damascus. And second, Israel unilateralism in Syria mirror that to the West Bank, where annexation rhetoric and buffer zone proposals similarly disregard Jordan's security interests. The Syrian file thus exposes a deeper tension in the Jordan-Israel relationship, shared objectives in containing Iran and extremist networks, but fundamentally different strategic doctrines. Jordan embedding security in inclusive, regional-owned frameworks, and Israel, under its current leadership, prioritizing unilateral military dominance, even at the expense of the long-term stability and the cooperative spirit envisioned in the 1994 treaty. So moving forward, and I'm going to conclude here, if we step back and look at the bigger strategic picture, one thing becomes very clear. Jordan and Israel are not just neighbors with complicated history, they are two of America's most important allies in the Middle East. And as Washington pivots toward Asia for years to come, reducing its direct footprint in our region, repairing and strengthening this bilateral relationship becomes even more critical for the US interest. This simple truth is that the United States cannot afford for its two key security partners in this volatile neighborhood to drift further apart. The April 12 and October 2nd missile interception episodes are a proof of concept that when Jordan and Israel coordinate under US-led frameworks, they can deliver tangible, mutually beneficial results that protect civilians on both sides and stabilizing the region. But to replicate that success, both countries need to reconcile their very different security doctrines. Jordan's emphasis on diplomacy and regional framework, and Israel's current preference for unilateral military dominance. The evolving regional dynamics actually offer an opening here. Iran and its proxies have been weakened in this region, and Arab states are becoming more open to a structured security cooperation. But they've also been very clear that without a credible political horizon on the Palestinian file, no sustainable long-term security framework will hold. This is where the US still has a unique convening power, even from a distance. Washington can help re-establish quiet, high-level channels, encouraging track 2 dialogue to diffuse tensions and revive cooperative economic and environmental projects that build trust from the ground up, and press Israel to integrate into a collective regional security architecture rather than operate outside of it. But for that to happen, Israel will need to shift from a mentality of containing and managing the Palestinian issue toward one of resolving the Palestinian issue. And without that shift, any broader security alliance will be limited in its ability from the start. In short, as America's strategic gaze turns eastward, the health of the Jordan-Israel relationship will be a key test of whether the US can still shape regional stability through its allies, or whether it will watch two of its most reliable security partners drift into a deeper mistrust at a greater cost for all three. And with that, I conclude. Thank you.
Andrew, you're
Yes,
muted.
no, thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground, and I commend you for opening your talk with a reference to quantum mechanics. The analogy here, of course, as you said, is the actions by one state have a dramatic effect on multiple others. And in the case of quantum mechanics, it's instantaneous. In the case of the Middle East, it probably takes a few minutes before one action gets a reaction. I will point out to you, if you want to reference quantum mechanics, you can also think about Schrodinger's cat. If you're familiar with that analogy, Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive at the same time. And it's a pretty well-known quantum mechanics puzzle. With that, well, thank you very much for illuminating so much about the Middle East, particularly from the Jordanian perspective. I now turn the microphone back to Alan Taylor, and Alan's going to wrap it up.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Farah Bdour, for staying awake and giving us such an incredibly rich talk. We're so grateful to you for taking the time from your hectic schedule, especially at this turbulent time and late hour for you, to be with us this afternoon for us and for such an articulate, thoughtful, historically, politically, religiously, and economically contextualized talk, and helping us understand the importance of Jordan in the Middle East and specifically Jordanian relations with Israel. We're so grateful for the sophistication and depth that you share with us and the precision in your presentation and the insights that we glean that enable us to be better and more active citizens here in the U.S. So thank you, and I'll let you get a breath before we reconvene privately. I'd like to point out to the audience that our next talk will be by Asli Aydin. She'll be speaking on Turkey's regional ascent amid democratic decline. That talk will be on August 24th at 5 p.m. That'll be the last talk for the season. I'm sure that between now and August 24th, we'll probably hear quite a bit from Turkey, so keep your ears to the ground for that. I'd like to point out finally that the Middle East Forum of Falmouth is a volunteer-run organization. We rely on your donations to keep the operation going. So I hope you'll be generous in your donations to the Middle East Forum. And you can go to www.meff.world to register for future talks, to assess the recordings of recent lectures, and to make donations that enable us to continue these lectures free of charge. And I think, given the fact that these talks have been so rich, many people will be, I think, inspired to go to the archives and look at the talks again. We do welcome your suggestions and feedback, and if you want to recommend future speakers, you can send us that information at infomeff.world@gmail.com. That's infomeff.world@gmail.com. And with that, I want to wish everybody a pleasant evening and thank Dr. Bdour again for sharing her deep understanding of the Jordanian-Israel relationship, and wish you a good rest of your evening. Thank you so much. We'll see you on the 24th again for Aydin Tashbash's talk. Good night.